Imagine closing your eyes for a moment and drifting back to mid-20th century America. The air is filled with the optimism of a nation that had survived war, but also with the unease of social changes, civil rights movements, and shifting moral landscapes. Out of this restless era would emerge a figure who promised belonging, love, and equality, but whose path would later reveal shadows deeper than anyone imagined. His name was Jim Jones. To understand the story of Jonestown, we have to begin with Jim himself. He was not born a leader of thousands. He was a boy from Indiana, a place of quiet towns and conservative values. Born in 1931, James Warren Jones entered a world still struggling through the Great Depression. His childhood was marked by poverty, loneliness, and a deep hunger for recognition. Those who knew him as a child described him as peculiar, even unsettling at times. He was fascinated by religion, not in the playful way many children might be, but with a seriousness that felt beyond his years. He held little funerals for dead animals, mimicking the rituals of pastors he had seen. His early interest in death and ceremony set him apart, both intriguing and troubling his neighbors. Yet alongside that fascination was an undeniable charisma. Even in his youth, Jones could command attention. He had a way of making others feel as though he understood them, that he cared deeply about their struggles. This ability to connect would later become one of his greatest tools, drawing people toward him in ways that were both magnetic and dangerous. Growing up poor shaped his worldview. His father was a disabled veteran, unable to provide consistently, while his mother worked tirelessly. Jim grew up feeling alienated, often an outsider, but that outsider identity sharpened his desire to be seen, to be respected, and to one day control his own destiny. In his teenage years, Jones was a voracious reader. He devoured books on religion, politics, and social theory. He was captivated by stories of leaders who could move entire nations, men whose voices could stir loyalty and obedience. He began to imagine himself as one of them, not just a small-town boy, but a figure destined to be remembered. The church became his first stage. By his late teens, he was already preaching in small gatherings, experimenting with the tone of his voice, the rhythm of his words, and the emotions he could stir in a crowd. People noticed. Some admired his passion. Others found it unsettling, but few could deny that he had presence. What made Jones different from many young preachers was his blending of faith and social justice. This was the 1940s and 50s, when racial segregation was still the law in much of America. Yet Jim spoke out against racism, insisting that all people, black or white, rich or poor, deserved dignity. For many, especially African Americans, his words were a breath of fresh air. In a time when many churches upheld segregation, Jones opened his doors to everyone. He wasn't just preaching equality, he was practicing it. He adopted children of different races, creating a family that was, in many ways, a living symbol of the world he claimed he wanted to build. For progressive-minded people, this was powerful. Here was a pastor not just talking about love, but living it. But charisma and ideals were not the only forces driving Jim Jones. There was also a deep undercurrent of ambition. He wanted more than a church. He wanted a movement. He envisioned not just a congregation, but a community built around his leadership, a place where he could guide every aspect of people's lives. By the 1950s, the seeds of that vision were taking root. Jones began attracting larger crowds, not just with sermons about God, but with supposed acts of healing. He would call people forward, touch their foreheads, and claim to banish illness. To many, it seemed miraculous. To skeptics, it was theater. But for those who believed, it was confirmation that Jones was chosen, anointed, perhaps even more than human. This blend of social justice, religious fervor, and theatrical healing gave rise to what would become the People's Temple. At first, It looked like a sanctuary for the marginalized, a place where interracial families, the poor, and the disillusioned could finally belong. For those who felt ignored by mainstream churches and by society itself, Jones's temple felt like home. But behind that warmth was a man learning, step by step, how to wield control. Each miracle reinforced his authority. Each sermon drew deeper loyalty. Each promise of equality made people willing to follow him wherever he would lead. And soon, Jim Jones would test just how far they were willing to go. By the early 1960s, Jim Jones was no longer just another small-town preacher. His congregation had grown steadily, and his reputation was spreading. What made him stand out was not only his fiery sermons, but his insistence on living the values he preached. He spoke of racial harmony, equality, and compassion, and then he actively worked to make those values real inside his church walls. The church became a safe haven for those who felt left behind. Black families, who faced discrimination in other congregations, found seats waiting for them at the People's Temple. Poor families, who couldn't afford much, were offered food and shelter. Jones insisted that the temple would not just be a place of worship, but a family, one where everyone's needs could be met. It wasn't long before people began to see the temple as something more than a church. It was a social movement. Jones organized soup kitchens, helped addicts find support, and provided legal aid to those in trouble. For many, especially those living on the margins of society, this was life-changing. To them, Jim Jones was not just a pastor, he was a savior. But every act of kindness had another layer. With each meal handed out, with each favor given, a subtle bond was being formed. Members were reminded that without the temple, they might have nowhere else to go. Gratitude turned into loyalty, and loyalty became the foundation of Jones's growing power. By the late 1960s, Jones had moved his operation from Indiana to California, a state buzzing with activism, counterculture, and a hunger for new ideas. It was the perfect environment for a man like him. California was fertile ground for social movements, and the temple flourished there. In cities like Guyana, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, the temple grew into the thousands. Racially diverse and socially active, it was hailed as a model of progressive Christianity. Politicians admired Jones for his ability to mobilize people, and soon he was rubbing shoulders with local officials, offering his congregation as a reliable voting bloc. Ones learned quickly that influence in America wasn't just about sermons, it was about politics. His ability to sway thousands of followers made him valuable. In turn, politicians offered him legitimacy, recognition, and connections. The line between church and political machine blurred, and Jones enjoyed the power it gave him. Meanwhile, inside the temple, the atmosphere was both warm and demanding. Members were expected to give generously of their time, money, and energy. They attended long services, volunteered for endless projects, and offered up personal details of their lives. Jones encouraged confessions, urging members to admit their faults in front of the community. On the surface, it was framed as healing. In reality, it built a system of control. With those confessions in hand, Jones created leverage. A person's secrets could be used to keep them loyal. If doubts arose, the memory of what they had revealed, or the fear of being exposed, kept them in line. What seemed like a spiritual exercise was actually a net slowly tightening around each member. Jones also pushed the idea that the outside world was dangerous. He painted a picture of society as corrupt, racist, and hopeless. Only inside the temple, he insisted, could true equality and love be found. By isolating his followers from the world mentally, he made them dependent on him emotionally. For many members, the temple became their entire life. They worked together, lived together, and socialized almost exclusively with other members. Families were encouraged to put the temple first, even above their own relatives. The community became a bubble, sealed off from outside influence, with Jones at its center. In this environment, Jones's voice became the ultimate authority. He decided where people worked, where they lived, and how they spent their money. He preached that sacrifice was noble, and members donated everything from homes to paychecks to the cause. What had begun as generosity turned into total surrender. At the same time, Jones's sermons grew more intense. He still spoke of love and justice, but now there were warnings woven in. Warnings about enemies, about betrayal, about the dangers of leaving the temple. Members were reminded that leaving wasn't just walking away from a church, it was walking away from salvation itself. The devotion of his followers gave Jones confidence. He began to test the limits of their loyalty. He staged healings that were little more than tricks, but the congregation accepted them as miracles. He staged emergencies, only to calm the crowd with promises of protection. Each test was a rehearsal, a way to measure just how much control he held. For those on the inside, Jones was a hero, a father, and even a prophet. But for those on the outside looking in, rumors were starting to spread. Some former members whispered of manipulation, long hours, and financial exploitation. To critics, it looked less like a church and more like a cult. Jones responded by tightening his grip. He warned his flock that critics were tools of the enemy, out to destroy the temple. To doubt him was to betray the cause. To leave was to invite ruin. The walls of loyalty grew higher, and the possibility of escape felt more and more distant for those inside. By the early 1970s, the People's Temple was at its peak. Thousands of members, influence in politics, recognition from society, all of it seemed to confirm Jones's vision. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. His need for control was growing, and his paranoia was deepening. And soon, those cracks would widen into a chasm that no one could escape. By the mid-1970s, the People's Temple was facing growing scrutiny. Journalists were digging into stories from defectors, uncovering allegations of abuse, financial exploitation, and authoritarian control. For Jim Jones, this was an existential threat. He needed an escape, somewhere beyond the reach of the American press and courts. At the same time, Jones's health was beginning to decline. Years of stress and rumored drug use left him weakened, often relying on medication and sunglasses to mask his struggles. Yet despite this, his ambition had not dimmed. If anything, the combination of paranoia and frailty made him more desperate to secure total loyalty from his followers. Jones began speaking of a promised land, a safe haven far from the corruption of the United States, a place where the temple could build a new society, free from racism, capitalism, and the scrutiny of outsiders. This vision became his rallying cry, a utopia in the jungle. The location he chose was Guyana, a small South American country with a socialist government that welcomed the temple's offer to bring investment and development. To Jones, it was perfect, remote enough to keep critics away, yet accessible enough to move hundreds of people. Most importantly, it was a blank canvas upon which he could write his dream. In 1974, the temple signed a lease for a large tract of land in the Guyanese jungle. It was dense, humid, and challenging, but Jones declared it fertile ground for building the future. The settlement was named Jonestown, after himself, though members were encouraged to see it as their collective project. A city of equality and peace. In the beginning, life in Jonestown had the air of adventure. Volunteers traveled ahead to clear the land, build houses, and prepare for the arrival of more members. They sang songs, worked long hours, and believed they were pioneers of something historic. The jungle was unforgiving, but the sense of purpose made the hardships bearable. By 1977, the migration accelerated. Hundreds of temple members left their homes, jobs, and families in the United States to relocate permanently. They sold everything, packed what they could, and boarded planes to a country most had never seen. For many, it was an act of faith, proof of their devotion to Jones and his vision. From the outside, it seemed like an extraordinary social experiment. A racially diverse community, living cooperatively in the jungle, working the land, and striving for equality. Reporters who visited at first were impressed by the energy and the dedication of the members. It looked like a dream made real. But inside Jonestown, the reality was far harsher. The land was difficult to farm, and supplies were scarce. Days stretched into exhausting labor under the tropical sun, with little rest. Malaria and other illnesses were common. Food was simple, often meager. Life in the jungle was not the paradise many had imagined. Yet Jones spun the struggles as proof of their nobility. He told them that hardship was part of building a just society. To complain was to be weak. To endure was to be righteous. Over time, members learned to accept the exhaustion as a badge of honor, convincing themselves that their sacrifices were for something greater. As the settlement grew, so too did Jones's control. He broadcast daily sermons over loudspeakers that echoed through the jungle. Even when he was not physically present, his voice was inescapable, reminding everyone of his authority and their duty. Privacy was nearly non-existent, as neighbors lived side by side in small cabins and were encouraged to report each other's doubts. Nights were filled with meetings that lasted hours, sometimes until dawn. Members sat through long lectures, listening to Jones speak about enemies who wanted to destroy them, about loyalty, and about the dangers of betrayal. Exhaustion kept people compliant. Fatigue dulled resistance. Jones framed Jonestown as a shining example of what the world could be if people abandoned selfishness and greed. He emphasized the racial harmony of the community, the shared work, and the equality of resources. For many, especially African Americans who had known discrimination in the U.S., Jonestown still felt like a refuge, despite the hardships. But beneath that veneer, cracks widened. Jones's paranoia intensified. He claimed the CIA was plotting against them, that defectors were spreading lies, that spies lurked everywhere. The outside world was painted as a constant threat, a monster waiting to destroy their fragile paradise. Punishments for disobedience became harsher. Members who broke rules, questioned Jones, or tried to leave faced public humiliation, forced labor, or confinement. The once welcoming community began to feel more like a prison, though few would admit it aloud. One of Jones's most chilling tools of control was the concept of loyalty tests. He would sometimes stage emergencies, announcing that enemies were closing in. On certain nights, he ordered members to drink from cups he claimed contained poison, only to later reveal it was a test of their devotion. These rehearsals planted the idea that ultimate sacrifice might one day be required. For those who had invested everything, their money, their homes, their families, the idea of leaving was nearly impossible. Where could they go? They were in a foreign country, with no resources, and under constant watch. To walk away from Jonestown was to risk not just rejection, but destruction. Despite the hardships, many clung to hope. They told themselves that every society faced challenges, that with time, Jonestown would flourish, that their sacrifices would one day be rewarded. It was this hope, nurtured and manipulated by Jones, that kept thousands anchored in the jungle, even as the dream began to wither. But the outside world had not forgotten them. Families back in the U.S. grew alarmed at the silence from loved ones. Reporters kept digging, and politicians, hearing rumors of abuse and control, began asking questions. What had seemed like a bold social experiment was now drawing suspicion. 50 Jones had hoped that Guyana would shield him from scrutiny. Instead, it became a stage where his vision of utopia was cracking under the weight of paranoia, exhaustion, and control. The dream of Jonestown was alive, but so too were the seeds of its collapse. By the late 1970s, the cracks in Jonestown were no longer invisible. Families in the United States were demanding answers about their loved ones. Journalists were circling with questions, and in Washington, lawmakers could no longer ignore the reports of human rights concerns coming from a distant jungle settlement. Jim Jones, once praised as a progressive preacher, now faced mounting suspicion. He told his followers that outsiders wanted to destroy everything they had built. He repeated again and again that enemies were gathering at the gates. His voice over the loudspeakers grew more strained, more paranoid, as if he was waging a war only he could see. Among those listening to the families was Congressman Leo Ryan, a representative from California. Known for his willingness to go directly into dangerous situations, Ryan decided to travel to Guyana himself to see Jonestown with his own eyes. He believed that if people wanted to leave, they should be free to do so. The announcement of Ryan's visit sent shockwaves through Jonestown. Jones tried to present it as a chance to prove their success, but beneath the surface, he was deeply unsettled. His power relied on controlling the narrative. The idea of an American politician arriving, armed with cameras and questions, was a threat he could not contain. In November 1978, Ryan and a small delegation of journalists, relatives, and concerned observers traveled to Guyana and then made their way into the jungle settlement. As they arrived, Jonestown was carefully staged, smiles were encouraged, food was prepared, and rehearsed speeches painted the community as thriving and harmonious. At first, Ryan's group was impressed. They saw neat rows of cabins, families working together, and children laughing. Members spoke about the unity of the community, the sense of safety they felt, and the equality they enjoyed. For a moment, it seemed as though the rumors might be exaggerated. But behind the rehearsed smiles, some were desperate. Quietly, secretly, a few members slipped notes to the visitors. "Please help us get out," one read. Another whispered directly to a reporter that they wanted to leave, but feared Jones's reaction. The facade was cracking, and the delegation realized that the surface story was far from the whole truth. Jim Jones knew this too. He tried to maintain his composure, but the news that some members wanted to defect shook him. To him, leaving was not an act of freedom, but an act of betrayal. His dream relied on unity, and unity could not survive open rebellion. The night after Ryan's arrival was tense. Members were restless. Some debated whether to seize the chance to escape. Others feared retaliation. Jones, visibly exhausted and increasingly unstable, gathered his people and spoke of enemies, betrayal, and the end of their dream. His words carried a tone of doom. On the morning of November 18, 1978, Ryan announced that anyone who wished to leave was free to join him. A small group of temple members, perhaps a dozen or so, stepped forward. It was a brave choice, but also a dangerous one. For Jones, it was confirmation that cracks were spreading faster than he could contain. Ryan prepared to depart with the defectors. Along with his delegation, trucks rumbled toward the nearby airstrip, carrying families who dared to take their chances. But tension hung heavy. Not everyone was celebrating. Some loyalists saw the departures as treason, and Jones's inner circle grew desperate to prevent the unraveling of the community. As the delegation prepared to board their planes at the small jungle airstrip, gunmen loyal to the temple appeared. In a burst of chaos, violence erupted. Congressman Ryan was struck down, along with several journalists and defectors. Others fled into the jungle, terrified and disoriented. The dream of Jonestown had crossed a line from illusion to irreversible tragedy. Back in the settlement, news of the attack returned quickly. Jim Jones, shaken and cornered, gathered his followers one final time. He told them that enemies would now descend upon them, that there was no future left, no escape, no way to preserve the dream. His voice, once filled with fire, was now heavy with finality. What followed has been remembered as one of the darkest moments in modern history. Jones urged his followers to make what he called a revolutionary act. To him, death was preferable to surrender. He framed it as dignity, as loyalty, as the ultimate sacrifice for the dream they had built together. Men, women, and children were brought together under the pavilion in Jonestown. Cups were prepared, passed, and consumed. The atmosphere was charged with fear, resignation, and devotion. Some went willingly, others resisted, and some were simply too young to understand. Within hours, the community that had once been a beacon of hope was silent. When Guyanese authorities later entered Jonestown, they found a settlement eerily still. The jungle was quiet, the cabins empty, the loudspeakers silent. What had begun years earlier as a promise of racial equality, compassion, and unity had ended in devastation. The people's temple was gone, leaving behind only questions, grief, and disbelief. News of the tragedy shook the world. Images and reports spread rapidly across newspapers and television screens. Families who had begged for help were left to mourn. Politicians who had once embraced Jones now recoiled in shock, and the name Jonestown became forever etched into history as a symbol of manipulation, control, and lost innocence. In total, over 900 lives were lost in the Guyanese jungle that day. It was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act, until the events of September 11. Decades later, for survivors, the memories were too heavy to put into words. For the world, it was almost too much to comprehend. The collapse of Jonestown was not only a story of one man's ambition and paranoia, but also a reminder of the human longing for belonging, for purpose, and for community. Those who followed Jones did so because they believed in the possibility of something better, and it was that belief, tragically, that was turned against them. Even now, decades later, the echoes of Jonestown remain. For some, it is a warning about the dangers of blind loyalty and unchecked authority. For others, it is a story of grief and remembrance. But for all, it is a reminder that even the brightest visions can cast the darkest shadows. In the days that followed November 18, 1978, the world struggled to process what had happened. Newspapers printed front-page headlines in bold letters. Television anchors spoke with visible shock, and families wept as names of the lost slowly emerged. The sheer scale of the tragedy felt almost impossible to grasp. For the Guyanese government, the task was overwhelming. Jonestown was suddenly a silent city in the jungle, filled with belongings left behind, letters never mailed, and cabins that would never again be lived in. What had once been a bustling experiment in communal living was now frozen in time. Survivors, those who had escaped into the jungle, those who had been away from the settlement that day, faced a lifetime of questions. Many carried heavy guilt, asking themselves why they had survived when so many others had not. Others struggled to reconcile the memory of Jones as a charismatic leader with the man who had brought about such devastation. Families back home in the United States faced grief, compounded by distance. Many had begged authorities for years to intervene, to look deeper, to act sooner. When the news broke, it was a confirmation of their worst fears, and yet it carried the weight of helplessness, as though nothing could have prevented the inevitable. The American government, too, was left reeling. Never before had so many of its citizens perished in such a way outside of war. Officials scrambled to explain, to offer condolences, and to retrieve the bodies of those who had perished. Jonestown was no longer a private matter. It was an international reckoning. Journalists who had once written flattering profiles of Jones revisited their stories with regret. How could they have missed the warning signs? How could a man once honored for his civil rights advocacy have come to this? The narrative of Jim Jones, transformed overnight from progressive pastor to cautionary figure of obsession and control. But perhaps the most difficult truth to face was that those who had followed him were not fools or villains. They were ordinary people, teachers, workers, parents, children, who had longed for a better world. They had sought community, compassion, and safety in an age of division and uncertainty. Their hope, sincere and human, had been turned against them. Over the years, countless scholars, psychologists, and survivors have tried to understand what Jonestown means. Some see it as a lesson in the psychology of manipulation, the way one person can exploit trust and belonging to dangerous extremes. Others see it as a political parable about power and paranoia. Still others focus on the resilience of survivors who rebuilt their lives from the ruins. For those who lived through it, memories remain vivid. They recall the long nights of lectures, the sound of Jones's voice over loudspeakers, the sweat of labor under the sun, and the fleeting moments of laughter that made them believe, for a time, that Jonestown could truly be paradise. These memories are complicated, layered with both love for the community they built and grief for how it ended. The name Jonestown has since become a symbol, often invoked in discussions of cults, control, and tragedy. Yet it is important to remember that behind the symbol were real people with real dreams. Their lives deserve more than to be reduced to a single word. They were mothers, fathers, children, friends, each with a story of their own. Then today, anniversaries of the tragedy are marked with quiet remembrance. Survivors and families gather, not to relive the horror, but to honor the lives lost, and to remind the world of the dangers of blind faith. In any leader who demands absolute loyalty, the ruins of Jonestown have long since been reclaimed by the jungle. Nature has covered what was once a thriving community, leaving only fragments. But in memory, in story, and in history, Jonestown endures. It is a ghost of a dream turned nightmare, a lesson written in the lives of those who believe. As we reflect on Jonestown, the story becomes less about one man's madness and more about the universal human longing for belonging. All of us seek places where we are seen, where we are valued, where we can feel at home. That longing is not weakness. It is part of being human, but when placed in the hands of the wrong leader, it can be used in ways that wound rather than heal. Jim Jones's story reminds us that charisma, compassion, and control can intertwine in ways that are difficult to see until it is too late. His rise was built on promises of love and justice, yet beneath those promises lay ambition and paranoia. His fall carried with it not just his own life, but the lives of hundreds who trusted him. In the end, Jonestown is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a living reminder to question authority, to cherish critical thinking, and to recognize the power of our own choices. It teaches us to balance our desire for belonging with the courage to walk away when belonging comes at too high a price. For those listening tonight, perhaps the lesson of Jonestown is not only cautionary, but also grounding. It is a reminder that your voice matters, that your freedom matters, and that no dream, no leader, no movement should ever demand the surrender of your humanity. So as the story closes and the night grows quiet, let us remember the people of Jonestown, not only for how their lives ended, but for what they sought: community, dignity, and hope. May their memory remind us to build these things in ways that are healthy, safe, and enduring. And with that, let the noise of history soften, the voices of the past grow faint, replaced by the steady calm of the present moment. You are here, safe, reflecting, and rest. The story of Jonestown will remain in the history books, but for now, you can let it drift into the background as you return to peace.